The smoke was not a vapor, it was a wall of black iron that tasted of roasted pine and the metallic tang of old copper. 22-year-old Elara fell to her knees in the red clay, her fingers clawing at the dirt until her nails split and bled. Ahead of her, across a narrow ravine that had become a river of liquid fire, the wooden beams of her family's barn groaned, buckled, and collapsed into a mountain of white-hot embers. The heat was a physical palm slamming against her face, singeing the edges of the wild, gravity-defying cloud of white-gold hair that stood like a permanent halo around her head. She opened her mouth to scream for her parents, but her vocal cords, unaccustomed to human language after a decade of absolute silence, could produce nothing but a raw, animalistic screech that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the timber. 10 years before that terrifying sky turned the color of a bruised orange, Elara had known a different kind of fire. It was the slow, freezing burn of 30 pairs of eyes locking onto her every single morning at Oak Creek Middle School. The morning bell did not sound like an invitation, it sounded like a gavel confirming her sentence. Inside the cramped, fluorescent-lit hallways, 12-year-old Elara stood frozen against the cold steel of locker 114, trying desperately to shrink into her oversized thrift store sweater. But it was impossible to disappear when your head was crowned by a permanent, translucent platinum-white cloud that defied every law of gravity. It didn't fall, it didn't flow. It stood straight out, shimmering like spun glass under the harsh lights. To the medical journals her parents spent late nights reading, it was Pili Trianguli et Canaliculi, Uncombable Hair Syndrome. To the children surrounding her, it was an open invitation to hunt. "Look out, it's the human dandelion," a sharp voice shrieked from the crowd. Shane, a boy with a cruel, easy smile and the casual arrogance of a schoolyard king, stepped forward from his circle of friends. He blew a hard, mocking puff of air directly into her face. "Make a wish, guys. If you blow on the freak's head, maybe she'll finally float out of our school and back to the circus." The hallway erupted into a chorus of sharp, ugly snickers. Elara kept her eyes locked on her worn sneakers, her hands trembling so violently against her backpack straps that the plastic buckles clicked. She tried to swallow the heavy lump in her throat, but her throat felt as though it were lining itself with sand. Her silence only fueled them. "Hey, Einstein. Did you stick your finger in an electrical socket this morning, or does your brain just look that stupid?" another girl sneered, shoving Elara's shoulder against the metal locker with enough force to rattle the hinges. "You look like a mad scientist who blew up her own lab. Why don't you use a brush for once in your life? It's disgusting. It looks like a bird died in there." Shane pulled a cheap, black plastic comb from his back pocket, flashing it to the cheering crowd like a gladiator displaying a weapon. "Hold her still," he commanded, his voice dripping with casual malice. "Let's see if we can tame the beast." 2 pairs of hands gripped Elara's forearms, pinning her against the cold metal. Fear, cold and sharp, flooded her chest as Shane stepped into her personal space, the scent of his cheap body spray clogging her nose. He slammed the plastic comb into the roots of her hair, right above her forehead. He pulled down with all his might. The plastic teeth snagged instantly against the anomalous, triangular hair shafts. With a loud, sharp snap, the comb broke cleanly in half. The kids laughed louder, pointing at the broken piece stuck in her white tufts, but Elara didn't scream. She didn't cry. A profound, hollow numbness washed over her. Her spirit simply stepped outside of her body, leaving a hollow shell behind against the lockers. That evening, the kitchen of the old farmhouse was dead silent save for the ticking of a grandfather clock. Elara sat at the wooden table, staring blankly into a bowl of chicken soup that had long gone cold. She didn't move. She didn't blink. Her father, Thomas, reached over the table, his rough, calloused hand gently covering her small, frozen fingers. "They broke her spirit, Martha," Thomas whispered to his wife, his voice cracking with a helpless, agonizing grief that he couldn't contain. They are killing our girl. She hasn't looked at us since she got off the bus. Martha pulled Elara into her chest, wrapping her arms around the girl's trembling frame and weeping softly into the wild, unyielding cloud of white hair. No more, her mother whispered fiercely into the quiet room. No more schools. No more towns. We are keeping her safe. We will build her a universe right here on this farm where they can never touch her again. The next Monday, while the school bus rumbled past their gravel driveway without stopping, Elara's formal homeschooling began. It was a curriculum written not by distant school boards, but by two desperate parents determined to heal a broken mind. The kitchen table became her desk. Her mother taught her algebra using the geometric patterns of quilt pieces, and her father taught her biology through the life cycles of the crops and the gestation of their livestock. The farm became a sprawling, golden sanctuary of earth and sky. On the farm, the cruel, reflecting mirrors of the school hallways vanished, replaced by the honest, unjudgmental eyes of the animals and the vast, whispering rows of winter wheat. Here, Elara's hair was no longer a cosmic joke, it was simply another wild, beautiful thing grown from the soil. She spent her days running through the high pastures, her hair blending perfectly with the fluffy, unrefined textures of the merino sheep she tended. Her parents didn't just teach her academics, they taught her manual labor as a form of therapy. They kept her hands constantly busy so her mind wouldn't drift back to Shane's laughter. She learned to mix chicken feed, to identify specific herbs by scent, and to knit wool using giant wooden needles. The farm gave her back her breath, but her human voice remained locked away. For 5 years of homeschooling, she never spoke a single sentence to her parents. She communicated through soft nods, written notes on a small chalkboard, and a gentle touch of her hand. Yet, though she was silent to humans, she learned to sing to the earth. It began during her 16th year, when she was alone in the deep valleys at dusk, grooming an old, blind rescue horse her father had brought home from an auction. The valley was completely still, the sun dipping below the ridge and turning the sky a deep magenta. Elara closed her eyes, felt the coarse hair of the horse beneath her palms, and opened her mouth. A sound escaped. It was not speech, it was a pure, sonorous, impossibly sweet melody that seemed to rise from the very center of her chest. The note was deep, rich, and carried the entire weight of her unspoken sorrow, the beauty of her isolation, and the boundless love she felt for the parents who had sacrificed their social standing in the community to shield her. The blind horse stopped chewing its hay, turning its ears toward her, leaning its heavy head onto her shoulder. From that evening on, the fields became her amphitheater. She sang to the wind, to the crops, and to the stars, developing a vocal range that was terrifyingly beautiful, completely unknown to the world beyond the fence lines. Then came the day the sky blew ashes. It was a Tuesday in August when the drought finally broke, not with rain, but with lightning. Elara was 3 miles away from the main house, deep in the northern canyons, trying desperately to herd a panicked flock of sheep that had become trapped in a thicket. The air suddenly turned thick and hot, smelling of roasted pine and sulfur. When she climbed a rocky outcrop, her heart dropped into her stomach. A wall of fire, fueled by 50-mile-per-hour canyon winds, was roaring over the western ridge. It wasn't creeping, it was a living, ravenous monster, jumping from treetop to treetop. Down in the valley, Thomas and Martha saw the flames cutting off the only gravel road leading to the high pastures. Neighbors who were loading their trucks screamed at them to get in, to flee toward the highway. But Thomas shook his head, his face white with terror. He gripped his wife's hand, and together, they ran directly toward the smoke, their lungs burning as the air turned to poison. They ran toward the canyon, screaming her name into a wall of absolute, suffocating heat. Elara! Elara, run to the river! Thomas's voice echoed through the trees one last time before a massive grove of dry pines exploded into a sheet of pure yellow flame. By the time Elara abandoned the sheep and broke through the thick smoke at the edge of the home property, the sanctuary was gone. The farmhouse where she had studied her lessons was a skeleton of burning timber. She dropped to her knees in the red clay, her hands clawing at the dirt, her vocal cords straining to scream for them. But the damage of her childhood silence was absolute, her throat locked, producing only that raw, heartbreaking screech. She watched her parents' world burn to nothingness. That night, a rescue worker found a silent, ash-covered girl with wild white hair wandering the highway, clutching a single silver locket she had found in the dirt near the driveway. She left the valley the next morning, vanishing into the gray, concrete expanse of a city hundreds of miles away. A decade passed like a slow, gray winter. The town of Oak Creek rebuilt its physical structures, but the memory of the Great Fire remained a permanent, haunting scar on the community. On a somber, overcast Thursday afternoon, the townspeople gathered in the central square for the 10-year memorial service. Rows of green folding chairs were set up on the grass before a newly erected granite monument bearing the names of those who had perished. Among the crowd sat the survivors. Shane was there, now a 32-year-old man with lines around his eyes and a quiet disposition, his hands folded respectfully in his lap. He sat near the front, carrying the weight of a town that had learned the hard way how quickly everything you take for granted can be turned to dust. The town mayor stepped up to the wooden podium, his microphone whistling slightly in the damp wind. To honor the souls we lost to the flames, the city conservatory has graciously sent a guest soloist to guide our remembrance today. We are deeply privileged to welcome Madame Elara. A woman stepped out from the town hall and walked slowly up the stairs to the podium. She was stunningly elegant, moving with a fluid, statuesque grace that drew every eye in the square. She wore a sharp, high-fashion black tailored suit that fit her perfectly, and a wide-brimmed black hat sat low on her head. A delicate, heavy lace veil hung from the brim, completely obscuring her facial features from view. The townspeople whispered among themselves, wondering who this distinguished, mysterious artist from the city could be, completely blind to the ghost that had just walked onto the stage. The small string orchestra behind her began to play. It was a mournful, weeping arrangement of cellos and violins that mimicked the sound of wind through empty valleys. The woman closed her eyes beneath the thick lace veil, tilted her head back slightly, and took a deep, stabilizing breath. She began to sing. The sound that erupted from the microphone was not just music, it was an elemental force that seemed to alter the atmospheric pressure of the entire square. It was a voice so deep, so rich, and so indescribably mellifluous that it vibrated through the metal chairs and into the very bones of the people sitting in them. She sang a melody without words, a traditional folk tune, the exact melody her father used to hum every morning while repairing the tractor in the barn, the very song she had sung to the rescue horses in the high pastures during her years of homeschooling. Her voice carried the suffocating, terrifying heat of the fire. It carried the crushing, lonely weight of a decade spent in city apartments where no one knew her name. But more than that, it carried the breathtaking, holy beauty of a love that death could not touch, the warmth of her mother's kitchen, the safety of the soil, the dignity her parents had given her when the world had called her a freak. In the audience, shoulders began to shake. A woman in the third row began to weep openly, covering her face with her hands. Shane felt a sudden, sharp tightening in his chest, a profound wave of grief washing over him that he couldn't explain. Tears spilled over his lower lids, tracking down his weathered cheeks. Every single person in the square was stripped completely raw, their own hidden regrets and private sorrows dragged into the light by the sheer, unadulterated emotional power of the stranger's song. It was a bridge between the living and the dead, a holy, sonorous sound that held the entire valley captive in a spell of collective mourning. The final, piercingly beautiful note soared above the rooftops of the town, clear and bright as a silver bell, hanging in the air for what felt like an eternity before fading into an absolute, breathless silence. No one applauded. No one moved. The silence was heavy, sacred, and thick with tears. The townspeople sat frozen, completely emotionally shattered, staring up at the veiled woman at the podium. Slowly, deliberately, the woman raised her elegant, black-gloved hands. Her fingers caught the edge of the wide-brimmed black hat and the heavy lace veil. With one smooth, continuous motion, she lifted them away from her head. A collective, sharp intake of breath bounced across the stone walls of the square. Without the restriction of the hat, a magnificent, gravity-defying halo of brilliant white gold hair cascaded outward, expanding into a perfect, shimmering cloud that caught the afternoon sun like a crown of pure diamonds. It was completely anomalous. It was entirely unique. It was the uncombable hair of the silent farm girl they had hunted through the middle school hallways 20 years ago. But it was no longer a bird's nest. It was no longer a mistake to be mocked. Styled with meticulous, professional care, it stood as a masterpiece of human variance, an avant-garde crown of spun glass that commanded absolute reverence. Her eyes, deep and piercing, were entirely devoid of the fear that had once defined her childhood. She stood tall, looking directly down at the people who had broken her. Her gaze shifted, settling directly on Shane. Shane's mouth fell open, his heart hammering against his ribs as his childhood memories crashed into the present reality. He remembered the broken comb. He remembered the name-calling. He looked at the magnificent woman standing on the stage, her white hair shining like a monument, and a profound, sickening wave of shame mixed with awe washed over him. The whispers returned to the crowd, but they were no longer cruel. They were laced with an overwhelming, reverent awe that bordered on worship. The mad scientist, the human dandelion of locker 114, had returned to them as a maestro. She stepped closer to the microphone, her speaking voice clear, commanding, and beautiful, carrying none of the stutter or silence of her youth. "The last time this valley saw me," Elara said, her voice echoing off the brick buildings, holding every adult in the square pinned to their seats, "my hair was filled with the ashes of my home and the heavy, suffocating weight of your judgment. When I was a child, you thought you could comb away my existence. You thought your cruelty could erase me from this town." She paused, her white gold crown gleaming in the sunlight as she looked at the granite monument behind her. "But my parents took me away from your poison," she continued, her voice swelling with an intense, emotional pride. "They homeschooled me in the safety of the soil. They gave me a sanctuary where I didn't have to hide who I was. The earth nurtured me, and the fire that took them only made my voice stronger. You called me a freak, but my parents called me a wonder. I am Elara. And I am finally home." She turned away from the microphone, stepping down from the podium with a slow, deliberate grace. She walked to the base of the granite monument, knelt down, and placed a single white rose directly beneath the carved names of Thomas and Martha. When she stood and walked back down the center aisle of the square, her silver crown gleaming like a shield, the crowd parted for her in absolute, stunned silence, not a single person daring to look away from the girl they had once tried to destroy.